All right, I'm Todd Neller, and in this work to strongly solve and find human playable strategies for the Great Rolled Ones game. This was joint work with Quan Nguyen, Phan, Linh Phan, and Cliff Presser. So we're going to start things off here with, let me get the screen up. So in this talk, we're going to first share the rules of the game and the optimality equations for the two-player game, our solution method for those equations. We'll look at optimal compensation points, which we could also call COMI, as in go, and for fairest play, and visualization of the optimal strategy. We'll also be presenting one simple human playable policy that does surprisingly well against optimal play. The Great Rolled Ones game is a Jeopardy dice game for two or more players, though, as I said, we'll only be considering the two-player case. It's a Jeopardy dice game, also called a push your luck game, where the primary mechanic is to make roll-hold decisions, where rolling is taking a chance to secure greater turn progress or perhaps lose all of one's turn progress, whereas holding secures that turn progress. It was first published in 2020 in book form by Sam Mischke and Randy Schoeneman. It's similar to the dice game Zombie Dice, and both are Jeopardy dice games in the 10,000 Jeopardy dice game family. So the rules are relatively simple. You play with standard five dice. The ones you see pictured here are still standard dice, but with the these monster pictures substituted in for the ones. And these are the undesirable numbers to come up. At the beginning of a turn, a player will roll 5 dice, and any ones that are rolled are set aside, and any non-ones are added to a player's turn total. And the turn ends when either the player decides to hold, that is to stop rolling, or they have rolled 3 or more ones during their turn. In that event, they end the turn with no score change. A round consists of each player taking one turn in sequence. And when any player ends their turn with a goal score of 50 or more, that triggers the last round of the game. And at the end of the last round, the player with the highest score wins. Now, the rules in the book give no indication of a draw possibility, so we assume for our analysis that a player is constrained to attempt to exceed the score of the current leader in the last round. As an example, if we start out with player 1 rolling a 1-1-3-4-5, the 2 ones are set aside and the 3 non-ones are added to the turn total to have a turn total of 3. Then if the player decides to roll again and rolls 2-2-4, no ones are set aside, and the 3 non-ones are added to the turn total to make 6. Rolling again, if player 1 gets 2 ones and a 6, those 2 ones are set aside for a total of 4 ones, and that's greater than or equal to the 3 ones that end the turn with no score gain. So the turn goes to player 2. Let's suppose player 2 rolls 4-4-4-4-5. No ones are set aside. Their turn total is 5. They decide to roll 4-4-4-5-5. No ones again set aside. Turn total is now 10. Third roll, 1-1-2-4-5. 2 ones are set aside. Only 3 non-ones are added to the turn total for 13. Player 2 decides to hold, and their turn ends with a score gain of 13. This 13 will never be at risk. The only thing that is at risk in the game is a person's turn total. So player 2 is locked in 13 points for the rest of the game.
All right, based on the example round, so there are 2 optimal equations we need to consider. You can see there's a risk of rolling a 1, so we need to find the probability of rolling a 1s. So in a non-terminal states are described within 5 tuples, P, I, J, K, O, with P denotes the current player number, 1 or 2. I is the current player score. J is the opponent score, and K is the current turn total. And O is the number of roll once that has been set aside. And now we need to find the probability of rolling once, and let P new ones, taking parameters of D, which is number of dice we are rolling, and new ones, O new. So O new has to be within the constraint of 0 and the number of dice we have. So next bar,
You can use the mouse roller as well.
And next one we want to find about the probability of player 2 exceeding player 1 score. This is a very special part of this game's characteristics, since your player 2s have a chance to exceed player 1s even when player 1s has reached the goal score. And that P exceed denotes the probability of player 2 exceed player 1 when the player 1 score is larger or equal to 50. Taking two parameters, which is delta is the score difference of player 1 and 2, and O is the number of roll one set aside for player's 2 turn. And the P exceed is 0 if the player 2s has 3 or more ones dice set aside, and P exceed is 1 when the delta is less than 0. So when the player 2 already exceed player 1, or else we just recursively compute the new probability of getting a new ones and the P exceed of the new ones we gain from rolling another 1. So next we need to find the probably winning with a roll. So when winning with a roll, so it's under assumption that optimal play. So thereafter we have the P exceed. Taking the P exceed if the player right now is player 2 and player 1 has exceed the goal score, which is 50. So they have to exceed the player 1 score. Otherwise, we'll find the probability of rolling new ones and the probability to win at that particular state. But if the roll has 3 or more dice set aside, now we compute the other player probability to win when they roll. And a player will never hold at the beginning of the turn, so they will never hold when the turn total was 0. Thus, we want to find the probably hold under the assumption of optimal play. So P hold will be 0 when the turn total is 0, or when it is player 2 and the opponent score is larger than 50. And P hold will be 1 if the player is player 2, their score has reached more than 50, and their score should be larger than the first player also. Otherwise, we want to find, if we hold, we want to find the probability to win, probability of winning of the first player or all the other player. So then the probability of winning can be assumed in the optimal play is we compute the maximum of rolling or holding, so depending on what choice we make. And now, so the equations are solved through dynamic programming. So these two equations are cyclic, so it's solved to the variation of value iterations from the initial arbitrary P value, which is 0. And then we just substitute the estimates in the equation from the right-hand side. And we just continuously recompute it until the maximum change to the probability is less than the value on the screen.
Next we will talk about the first player advantage and compensation points, which is also common. So we know that when player 1 finished with like 50 or above, then player 2 has no other choices but have to like exceed player 1 score. By doing that, player 2 has an advantage of like knowing what score needed to win. Therefore, with like both players having optimal play, player 1 and player 2 has a winning gap of like 10%, where player one has a lower winning rate compared to player two. Therefore, we want to introduce Kami, which are the compensation points designed to make like the game more fair. In our games, we suggest that player one should start with like 3 compensation points that will bring player one win rate up to like around 49.55% and making the gap between two players reduced to around like 0.9%, which is almost like not that bad, right? So here we will introduce the roll and hold surface where which show that like when a player should hold or when a player should roll when we have some kind of conditions like player one score, opponent score, and a turn total in that in a turn. So basically, when we have 0-1 set aside, player one, as you can see at the beginning, the surface is a little bit like steep because it is player one want to like aggressively reach the goal of 50 at the beginning. At a later stage of the game, when it already reached like 50, player one want to make like their score have a significant leading score compared to player two. So it would try their best. Player one would try their best to go as far as possible. But for player two, at the beginning, you can see player two seems to take less risk, and player two only want to like maintain a good like distance compared to player one score. But at the later stage of the game, like both players want to win the game, right? So it will start to roll until reaching like 50 points. And when player one already reached like 50, player two has no choice. So as you can see, player two will try to like keep rolling and rolling until it exceeds player one. Let me show you the like it just doesn't work. Okay. So next we will move on to the case where we only have like one dice one set aside. So this is a little bit like much more complicated compared to when having 0 dice one set aside, because at the beginning you can see like both players seems to take like less risk, and but still player one still take a little bit like more risk compared to player two because it has some kind of disadvantage. But at a later stage, both want to reach 50 as soon as possible, so both still will keep rolling until they reach like 50. And still like the same as the previous case, player one will try to reach above 50 as much as possible in order to keep like a good distance compared to player two. And player two will continue to roll and roll if possible in order to win when player one has reached like 50 points. And next we will move on to the case where we have like 1 dice set aside. So in this case, it is very risky because if we unfortunately have one more dice one set aside, or then we will lose all our turn total. So at the beginning of the stage, both players are very careful and they take almost like very little risk. As you can see, like they usually hold at around like 5 or 2, but at a later stage of the play, player one of course want to win, right? So it will start to take a lot of risk and in order to reach like 50. And layer two, just like the same, it will start like it will keep rolling until it exceeds player one. So from here we can compare a little bit. For when having 0-1 set aside, both players like seems to take more risk because take more risk. So the curve is like very steep for both players compared to the other cases. Player one always take more risk compared to player two because it has like a disadvantage compared to player two. And when the more one dices they have, the less risk they are gonna take for themselves. And
skip this, go on to the policy.
okay. So this is the policy, right? So we want to introduce our simple player and one cases policy, where it will help reduce the winning gap of two players from around 10% to only 2%. So for player one, they will always roll with 5 dice. Before, when they have 4 dice, they will start to hold at or beyond the goal with a lead of at least 20. For player two, if player one has reached the goal score, player two has no choice but have to exceed it. Or if player two has reached like above 50 already, they just can hold and win. And in the other case, player two will keep rolling until we're gonna have 4 or 5 dice. And with 3 dice, both players should hold if it reached the goal score or when the turn total is at least 5.
Yeah, so this achieves only a 2% gap against optimal play. In conclusion, we've computed strong solution of this optimal play for all states of the Great Rolled Ones game. We found that 3 compensation points awarded to the first player make for greatest fairness. And as you just heard, a relatively simple human playable strategy has only a 2% gap short from the optimal win rate. So we can take questions.
Thank you very much. If people have questions, please chat them or pose them. So here's a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is that I don't know what would happen if the turn order was player one, player two, player one, etc. It's an interesting sort of question, and it essentially would make it so that a person could take greater risks, for trying, over 2 turns. They'd know that they'd have that kind of budget to either exceed the score, but I honestly don't know what it would look like. Other questions?
Well, maybe you can substantiate the 2% gap. I mean, it is of course good that you have the observation, but what are the advantages to give the 2% gap a chance towards, I would say, running the risk of losing?
So the 2% gap that's described here is that the approximate win rate of a simple player and one's cases strategy is 49% against optimal, which is pretty surprising given the non-linearities and subtleties of the optimal roll hold boundary. And yet a very simple strategy performs very well against it. We actually, in the paper, you can find not only that, but 3 other strategies that have a range of different gaps. The one that was not in the paper, that would have taken too much space to publish, we got it down to a set of rules with simple arithmetic and cases that achieved a 0.5% gap to optimal. So there's a trade-off between complexity of the human play policy and its performance.
And the complexity, is that easily computable or not?
Well, by complexity, I mean that, if we look at the at different policies, if we were to put them in code, the simplest is just always roll with 4 or 5 dice,
Yes.
holding when you win. Having fixed values that you hold at is more complex. The one that Linh described is a simple player in one's case, and this one is in the paper. This is a 1% gap, but quite honestly, this involves memorizing more cases and more constants than I would care to memorize in order to improve my win rate by just 1%. So the 0.5% gap would take even more, not quite double the number of rules, but such that I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to read it on a slide.
This answered my question perfectly. Thank you very much, and congratulations with your team. All members gave a very good presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Flatlin asks whether this approach can be generalized to other similar roll or hold games.
And the answer to that is yes, that over the years, Cliff Presser and I have published a number of papers for different Jeopardy dice games that make use of the same general technique. In the future, we hope to push for even more complex rule sets and state spaces.
Great. Thank you very much. I believe our session is finished now. Thank you very much to the speakers.